Doesn't seem to be about blacks. It's about the CIA and Jews. So it's probably a conspiracy.
CIA and establish some important things to understand about how they operate first, to understand all these stories. So where did the CIA actually come from? The CIA is established in 1947, but it was preceded by an organization called the OSS. And this was a wartime intelligence organization that was started during World War II in the aftermath of some sabotage attacks in New York City and other espionage that was happening during the war on the part of the Germans and the Axis powers that we were fighting. So the OSS forms up. That's the precursor to the CIA. It's a wartime intelligence outfit. Now, we're not going to go into all the particulars and details. There's a couple of things we need to understand about the CIA during World War II and shortly afterward at the beginning of the Cold War. In the first place, some of the most important sources, confidential sources that provided human intelligence for the OSS during World War II came through Italy. The United States invades Italy in 1943. They take over the Italian peninsula, and this is like their springboard into the European continent to fight Hitler and to fight the European Axis powers. The OSS rapidly establishes themselves inside of Italy. And one of the biggest sources of intelligence during the war for the OSS was Jewish refugees that fled Nazi-occupied territory through Italy. The Nazis occupied a vast swath of territory in Germany.
Okay, so he's saying that Jewish people were being spies. I'm following.
Germany, in Austria, all over Northern Europe, where a lot of Jews lived. And when the Jews were fleeing Nazi captivity or persecution, they fled to Italy, where they were not going to be subjected to some of the anti-Semitic policies, and ultimately where they were liberated by the United States when the U.S. invaded and landed there. Now, the Jewish refugees fled Germany and Austria into Italy, and they provided a massive source of confidential intelligence for U.S. wartime intelligence. And you have to understand why that is. Those Jewish refugees had information about Germany, about Austria. What's more, they spoke the language. They spoke German, spoke the lingua franca of the Nazi Empire. Also, they were hostile to the Nazi Empire, being Jews. So these Jews that were leaving Nazi Germany, these are like ready-made intelligence units because they hate the enemy, they speak the enemy's language, and they used to live on the enemy's territory. So very quickly, in the 1940s, U.S. wartime intelligence is using these Jewish refugees to get information on the Nazis. They're using Jewish refugees as intelligence agents, penetrating Nazi Germany along the border. The person that ran this intelligence operation was a guy named James Jesus Angleton.
Jesus, ironic.
He was in charge of all of the OSS operations on the Italian peninsula, and he got in charge a little bit later, but he got there in 1943 with the rest of the Allies. And it was Angleton who was running this operation. And Angleton saw the value of these Jewish refugees as intelligence officers. They were a great asset for what would become the CIA. This is important to understand. Now, later on, of course, the Allies win World War II. We defeat Nazi Germany. And in the next 5 years after the war is won, the United States enters a Cold War with the Soviet Union. And all of a sudden, the Soviet Union becomes the primary adversary. 1947, the OSS becomes the CIA. James Angleton becomes one of the founding fathers of the CIA. And he is put in charge of being a liaison between U.S. intelligence and foreign intelligence agencies. 1948, the State of Israel is declared. They declare their independence. They fight a brief war with the Arabs. The U.S. recognizes them. And James Angleton begins liaising with Israeli intelligence as part of his job description, founding father of the CIA, running counterintelligence, and working as a liaison with our allied intel agencies. Pursuant to the emerging Cold War, the Soviet Union became our primary adversary. But there was a big problem. An Iron Curtain had descended onto Europe. The Soviets were not letting anybody leave the Soviet Union or later on the Warsaw Pact countries. The Soviet Union was a closed-off society. Joseph Stalin made it like a fortress. And so in the early days of the CIA, in the early days of the Cold War, we had no knowledge of what was happening inside the Soviet Union. We had no human intelligence, no sources that were inside of Russia, and Stalin had created this impenetrable fortress. There was no way to get in. That is until the 1950s. During the 1950s, there was a major aliyah. An aliyah is when the Jewish people leave their country from the diaspora and go to Israel. There's been many waves of aliyahs over the years. I think there's 6 or 7 major aliyahs. This is when a Jew makes their pilgrimage, they leave, and they return to the Holy Land to reside in Israel. In the 1950s, there was a major aliyah of Jews. Russia had a massive Jewish population. They left the Soviet Union and went to Israel. James Angleton understood the value of Jewish refugees as an intelligence source. Just as in Italy during World War II, Austrian and German Jews were very helpful human sources to tell us secrets about Nazi Germany, and they spoke the language and they carried out operations and they knew about those countries in which they resided. Angleton, now running the foreign desk at the newly created CIA, he saw the value in Jewish refugees that left the Soviet Union and went to Israel. And so James Angleton began a working relationship with the Israeli intelligence agencies like Shin Bet and Mossad. And a quid pro quo relationship was established. Israel understood, just like Angleton did, the value of the intelligence that the Jews leaving Russia had for the United States. And Israel was not going to give that intelligence away for free. As the Jewish refugees left Russia and came into Israel, the Israeli intelligence agencies like Shin Bet would pick them up off the street and interview them. They would gather all the information and put them under confidence. They would gather all the information that the Russian Jewish refugees had, and they would go to their liaison from the CIA, James Angleton, and they would offer him a deal. The Israeli intelligence agencies would say, if you give us American intelligence on our adversaries like Egypt and Syria, if you give us intelligence on nuclear weapons, then we will give you the intelligence from our Jewish refugees that left Russia. That was the quid pro quo relationship that went from the 1950s until Angleton left the Israel desk in the early 1970s. So from the very beginning, from the 40s during the time of the OSS and World War II, through to the beginning and the height of the Cold War in the time of the CIA, you have to understand that U.S. intelligence and Israeli intelligence, in particular Jewish refugees, were inextricably connected. So much so, many people talk about the assassination of John F. Kennedy and the role of the CIA in it. People point to James Angleton. James Angleton managed a team of hundreds of people with a black budget. Many of them oversaw the handling of John F. Kennedy's assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald. The people that opened Lee Harvey Oswald's mail and read it, the people that met with him in real life, they were Jewish. They were Jewish refugees from Russia. And they were a part of Angleton's hand-picked team working with a black budget, liaising with the state of Israel. The CIA and Israeli intelligence from the jump were intertwined like this. And the reason for this is not hard to understand. This is another thing to comprehend about the CIA before we get into William F. Buckley. James Jesus Angleton was not Jewish. He was American. He came from Idaho. And you might say, was he Jewish? Was he secretly Jewish? What was the motivation? It was pretty simple. James Angleton was a virulent and fierce anti-communist. He would do anything to fight the Soviet Union. And in the 1950s, when we had no idea what was happening in Russia, he would do anything to get his hands on intelligence about Russia and about the Soviet Union, even if it meant working with the Israelis, even if it meant giving the Israelis classified information about nuclear weapons. What's more, James Angleton saw Israel as an ally against the Soviet Union in the Middle East. After 1955, Egypt and Syria were armed by the Soviet Union. They received weapons, tanks, planes, and over the 50s, 60s, and 70s, moved further and further into the orbit of the Soviet Union. And on the great chessboard of the CIA and the Defense Department, all these different anti-communists, they saw Israel as a bulwark against Soviet communist influence in the Middle East. So that was the basis of their cooperation. Just like in World War II, they wanted to defeat the Nazis so that the United States could liberate Europe. During the Cold War, they wanted to defeat the Soviet Union. That's why they backed Israel and used Jews as an intelligence agency, effectively. Something else was created in the 1950s. This is the last thing we need to establish about the CIA before we get into William F. Buckley. What the CIA was really worried about in the 1950s was the ideological battle that the communists were waging on America. Because in addition to the Cold War being an arms race, a space race, being fought in proxy wars in Asia, Latin America, and in the Middle East, it was also an ideological battle. And in the same way that the Soviet Union was providing weapons and building nuclear weapons and doing all of these conventional or non-conventional military activities, the Soviet Union was also supporting an international communist element. They were backing communist political parties. They were backing communist book clubs, campus organizations, backing communist intellectuals. And if you know anything about the Red Scare, which happened in the 20s and then again in the 50s, and really was in place throughout the duration of the existence of the Soviet Union, the U.S. government and CIA, first the FBI, then the CIA, were very concerned about communist and Soviet penetration of American society through the use of spies, double agents, pushing communist ideology. So just like the Soviets, the CIA also engaged in an information ideological war. The Soviets gave weapons, the CIA gave weapons. The Soviets fought proxy wars, so did the CIA. The Soviets developed a space program for the purpose of missiles, so did the CIA with Project Paperclip. And just like the Soviet Union had communist ideological allies all across the world, so did the CIA. In the 1950s, the CIA backed a program called the Congress for Cultural Freedom. And I'll read this blurb about it. This is from Wikipedia. It says, in 1950, a group of intellectuals founded an organization called the Congress for Cultural Freedom with the aim of consolidating an anti-totalitarian intellectual community around the globe. The CCF's connections with the United States CIA were definitively established 16 and 17 years later in reports by the New York Times and Ramparts magazine, respectively. They claimed that the CIA, operating through a series of dummy foundations, had been instrumental in organizing and funding the CCF. Two people who were critical at the very beginning, and this will be important later, are Irving Kristol and James Burnham. They were both there in Berlin in West Germany at the founding of the CCF. Congress for Cultural Freedom in the 50s and 60s claimed to be an organization of pro-freedom intellectuals, many of them liberal. Many of them were left-wing or center-left liberal. And the claim of the Congress for Cultural Freedom is that they were leftists or liberals against radicalism, against communism. Some of them were even Trotskyites, but they were against Stalinism and against the Soviet Union. Some of the biggest names in the conservative movement in the 50s and 60s. Some of the biggest magazines with the conservative or even liberal ideological orientation in the 50s and 60s received money from the Congress for Cultural Freedoms. Many names you'd recognize were involved with this group. And throughout those 2 decades, nobody knew that the entire time this outfit, which was providing seed money for magazines, radio stations, TV stations, books, book clubs, you name it, it was receiving money from the CIA the entire time. Many of the constituent projects did not even know about the connection. The Congress would provide money for a small magazine. They'd provide a grant for an intellectual. And the recipients of these grants themselves, in some cases, did not even know that ultimately the money came from the CIA. That was revealed many years later. So this is important to understand about how intelligence in America operates. Again, World War II and the Cold War, they're relying upon Jewish refugees. They see Israel as a bulwark against communism. The CIA, even the elements that are not Jewish, or even necessarily sympathetic to Israel because it is Jewish, they were very pro-Jewish because of what they believed they could gain in their fight against the Soviet Union with the organized Jewish community in the world and with the state of Israel. And then, and aside from that, the CIA is fighting an ideological battle against totalitarianism, against Stalinism. And so they're backing a lot of conservative intellectuals, liberal and conservative, that are saying, you know, even if they're not conservative, they're against radicalism. They're against the turn of the American left to full-fledged socialism and communism. And that is so that they...
This was very informative. I'll have a lot to look into. I think the things he's saying are factual. I'm just not seeing the issue with this from the standpoint of America had problems with various foreign nations. Israel was able to help them through the spies, and then in return, Israel got access to America and things that America was doing in terms of like nuclear bombs and influencing power in America. So it seems to be something where both sides gain something, and that's kind of potentially where this our greatest ally came. World War II is a big world war. Israel helped us then. The Cold War was a big military situation. Israel helped us then. And then Israel was able to help us in terms of our positioning with having a base and a place to find out about things going on in the East, as well as Africa and potentially Asia, even though he didn't bring that up. So it just seems like a friendship or an ally that grew out of mutual benefit. So I would just say, if at some point the American-Israel relationship is not beneficial to either side, America or Israel should just reevaluate the relationship. If you like this video, please smash the like button, comment, and subscribe. New shows airing Monday through Thursday.